Well, hello, CareCast, and thank you to the CareCast team for this invitation to talk about leads at work. I want to start with a territorial acknowledgement, please. I would like to invite you to think about the land you're on and your heritage and how it is that you and your people came to the lands and where you are. I'm currently on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people who inhabited these lands, prior to colonial contact, and we continue to experience the legacy of colonization. And in that spirit, I certainly strive to contribute to a health and care system that's equitable, safe, and welcoming to everyone. I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose, and that said, I'm interested and sometimes conflicted. We could talk about that at another time, but I certainly will disclose my interest in improving patient and family outcomes, and of course, care provider outcomes and organizational outcomes. So a little different format this time around. Going to try to see how this works. As we talk about some of the leads content. Now, I suspect many of you, most of you, maybe all of you are used to the leads framework and these 5 domains. During this particular CareCast, I'm going to focus on these 3. I'm going to talk a bit about lead self. I'm going to talk a little bit about achieve results and also a little bit about system transformation. In all 3 of these, I'm going to take kind of a high level look at some of this content and just share kind of some of the things from my perspective, my frame on some of this content. So let's start with lead self. Let's think for a moment about self-awareness, about managing yourself and developing yourself. And certainly these days, lots of conversation about mindfulness, lots of conversation about resilience, and I sure value that content. What I also want to share is, a little trip to the beach. So let's go to the beach together. Let's go to this beautiful beach, and let's go there with those 2 fine people. Those are my daughters. And I've been there with my daughter several times. This happens to be Long Beach at Tofino. And why are we going to the beach on a CareCast? Well, because I have this piece of paper, this laminated in my here at my house, and it's hardiness, and it's the definition of hardiness, and it's in addition to resilience, in addition to mindfulness. I invite you to think about hardiness as part of your managed self in the lead self framework. So I don't think hardiness has got as much attention as some of those other elements, and so I just want to shine a light on it. And as you can see, hardiness is a sense of meaningful purpose, which comes from commitment within one's life. And when I think about the care providers I know, many of them talk about this, or they feel distressed when they can't meet this commitment and they can't fulfill their purpose, as it were. So see the next item, right, of hardiness, this belief that one has influence over one's surroundings, and similarly, belief that you have influence over outcome of an event. And this next item is a worldview, as you can see, where change rather than stability is normal, and that we can learn and grow from both positive and negative experiences. And so I think hardiness is awesome. And when I think about a facet of life that I want others to have, say, for instance, my daughters or my son, I'd like them to have hardiness. And so I'm inviting you, too, to just reflect on the role that hardiness plays in your worldview and in your sort of lead self toolbox. So from here, I want to go to this idea of the voices in your head, the motivations or perhaps the demotivations that you may or may not hear, because sometimes they can be really subtle. So I want to talk about what they call motivational drivers. So this is an old school concept, 1975 even. Look at that. So motivational drivers in terms of how they impact lead self. They are these, as you can see, these unconscious blueprints. They're like the things that maybe we heard as we were growing up from coaches, parents, other people who were sort of driving us in our lives. And over time, these drivers just become embedded. We don't even know we're saying them. We can't even necessarily hear them per se, but they're there, eh? And these steer our behaviors. So let me share them with you. Here are what have been identified as the so-called 5 primary motivators. And perhaps some of these are familiar to you. You know, as a type A personality, AA, AAA, whatever the case may be, perhaps these are familiar. These drivers of like, please others, try harder, hurry up, be perfect and be strong. So there they are. Maybe these are familiar to you. And if they are, you may have found that they're actually really hard to obtain, to maintain, to have always in the forefront. And they really can drive people to go to places that if you were more self-aware and if you were managing yourself, you might not go to those places. So what would a reframe on this look like? Well, a 2.0 on these motivational drivers might look like, instead of pleasing others, you're balancing self and others. And try harder might be a place just like do the best you can in the moment, please. And similarly, hurry up, be time appropriate. As you can see, be realistic and know your strengths and not add the strengths of others around you. And so that's, I think, a reframe, a 2.0, as it were, on motivational drivers. And I'm going to, again, sort of file that under lead self, manage self. Now I'm going to invite you to think about what you don't want to do. And this may be a clinical something. It may be something about leadership or followership or team. Might be there's something you don't want to do in work, right? And so it's a rhetorical question, and I want you to just sort of get a sense of some of those things, and we're going to come back to them once or twice now in this conversation. Again, thinking about leading self. So sometimes I think that if we do ask people this question, like, what don't you want to do? How could we gather that information? Well, if people identified those things, is there ways we could maybe gather them together into buckets, as it were, and explore what those buckets are? And I'm going to come back to that idea. But generally speaking, what I first want to invite is this idea of, okay, now that we've identified these things that you don't want to do, you've identified what you don't want to do, so what are we going to do about it? So the answer is not to dig in, bury, don't look up, avoid eye contact. Rather, it's how do we proactively engage these situations that we'd rather avoid. And I think that's the real benefit of asking this question, is to get to this place of doing something about it. And so for me, a way to do this is to simulate. I really believe in simulation, as practicing the practice. And for many of you, simulation is the kind of things that you see in the upper part of the screen. You know, the high acuity, low frequency, high intensity type practice, which simulation lends itself so well to. But I also want to show that simulation might also be a leadership conversation, a mentorship conversation, and practicing the practice of a difficult conversation, as shown here with Gurpreet and our colleague Anna McDonald. So we did that and used the LEADS framework to practice having leadership conversations. And so again, when I think about develop self, I think about practicing the practice, which, as you have said already, means lots of different things to lots of different people. And if you want to proactively approach the things you don't want to do, consider simulating them. So I'm going to jump now into the achieve results part. And here, thinking about in particular this content around alignment with vision and values. Alignment with vision and values. So I think it's wise, and I invite sort of an exercise around defining what your values are. And then I want to talk about like exercising your values and what I mean by that. So many of us here at Island Health are super familiar with this living our values graphic, and we've seen the organizational values of courage, aspire, respect, and empathy. And at the same time, I invite you to think about what are the principles that you really value, that you find important to your life. And if you can identify those, or similarly, if you want to look at these, how do you exercise them? So by exercising them, what I mean to say is, how do you put sort of the work that we do, the context that we live, and apply our values? So by way of metaphor, I think about like going to the gym or working out. You don't go to the gym and lift light weights and walk away feeling good, right? You go to the gym, you exercise, and you feel the tension of your muscle. You feel the tear even sometimes. You feel the next day that you're sore. Or similarly, if you go to a place of worship, you don't always go to a place of worship to have your beliefs affirmed, but sometimes you go to a setting like that to have things challenged and have your values, your beliefs, your principles stretched a little bit and put to the test, exercised. That's what I mean by exercise. So what are your core values? And if you're going to align with them in your work, how do you practice that? How do you put them to the test, as it were, so that you know, you'll have faith that they actually will stand up and are strong enough to do the work you want them to do? Earlier in my career, I thought also about what are those things I don't want to do. And what I realized about them is there was some themes that were being generated. So sometimes the things I didn't want to do were about clinical. I didn't know this. I didn't know how to do that. I've never even heard of the thing, you know. But other times there was themes related to them. And those themes, I'm going to say, were values and principles. And I've kind of generated it down to this list of 3 things. And so this is my core values that I find are the ones that when I think about work and the challenges I've had, these are the ones that I sort of often file the stories into, like one of these 3 buckets. Now, maybe there's other core values for you, but these are the 3 for me. If I make a long list, these are the 3 that I can't do without. Other ones I can maybe negotiate, but these are really central to my values. Values around control, mortality, and justice. And over the years, I've had to exercise these and really come to terms with what do these mean for me, and how does the work I've done and continue to do align with these values. And so control is a big one for people, and it speaks about exertion of power, and it's almost absolute in its impact, whereas a flip side of control might be something more like influence. If we were to reframe that a little bit. And I find like I rarely have control, but I often have influence. So there's my link to hardiness on that front. Mortality. I was an emergency room nurse for years, on the front lines as a volunteer firefighter before that in my life. And so I did have to reconcile where was my sort of morality, where were my values around death. And I had to accept that was part of living. And despite our best efforts, we haven't changed the death rate. It's still 1 per person. And so there was something there about reckoning with mortality and putting that reckoning to work, put it to exercise, right? So that when I did come in face to face with it, I was better equipped. My values could stand the test of the experience. And last but not least, for me was justice, around fairness and an imagination that I had earlier in my life that bad things didn't happen to good people and that the world was just. And then as I got older, because I'm 1 billion years old now, but as I've gotten older, I see that in fact, it's a really unfair, random world. And so despite my affinity for justice, I also appreciate when I put it to the test, it isn't always just. So all that to say, for me, when I think about, what do I want to do, they landed in these buckets. And so I think about aligning my values along these 3 values, aligning them with my work and trying to just reconcile, put them to the test, as I've said. So maybe there's something there for you, define and exercise your values as a way to achieve results according to leads, in particular around that alignment with your vision and values. So last but not least, I want to talk a bit about systems and systems thinking and some tensions that I see around innovation and how that impacts my view of system and perhaps may inform yours. So many of you who I've talked to before have heard me talk about this. So those of you who haven't, please come along for this ride. This is what I like to say, what's above and below the waterline. So the metaphor, I hope is becoming apparent to you. You can see what's above the waterline. You can't see what's below it, and yet what's below it is equally impactful, sometimes more impactful. So if we flush this out a bit more, what we see are things like the objective or the quantitative aspects of healthcare, the behaviors, the systems, the structures. And what we don't see, what's below the waterline, are those subjective, those qualitative facets of culture, relationship, and of course experience. And if I add another layer of explanation to this now, in terms of behaviors, it's like how we do what we do. It's the actions, it's the workflows, often described as work is done, versus the systems and structures or the policies and procedures that you may have heard described as work is imagined. And so there is a difference in my worldview above the waterline around what is work is imagined versus work is done. And sometimes they're very, very different. And the further they are from different, kind of the more interesting it is to me. And so why I think this matters is if I don't have this understanding, I can't sort of bring them together and find those tensions. So what are the tensions I'm speaking of? Well, an example would be workarounds. So work is imagined describes the work, and there's policies and procedures, and that's what we do around here, except for when we don't. And when we don't, that goes different ways, different times. Sometimes we don't do it and it goes really well and people are seen as experts. In fact, we use words like agile to describe their abilities. Other times we deviate from work as imagined, some kind of workaround, for instance, and it doesn't go well. And at those times, our responses are not as generous, but rather we respond with things like, how come you did that? What were you thinking? We need another policy to enforce our policy, and we have to sharpen our pencil on the procedure. So why do I bring that up? Well, at the above the waterline level, I'm hoping that this distinction is useful for you. And what I'm unaware of is how does that influence matters below the waterline? So when we think about our experience of that tension, what does it mean for us when we go home after a day of work, knowing that we found the path between, we found the workaround, and no one caught us, no harm came, but we're still kind of incongruent, you know? And so they call that drift. As you drift away from work is imagined and work is done is different, I'm unaware of the impact of drift. But I do see often that there is a divide between work is imagined and work is done. And so to come back to this sort of leads conversation, I'm just inviting this as a system thinking. This is a system thinking frame for me. So what's below the water? Well, as you can see, it's why we do what we do. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. It's why we come and disclose what we disclose. It's why we do territorial acknowledgements. It's why we say thank you. It's our vision, as we described before. So it's the meaning of our work. So lots here in the experience. Similarly, culture and relationships. And it's who we do it with, who we do it for, who has a say in what we do. Are we doing work with families or to families? And when we say meeting people's needs, whose needs are we meeting? Ours, theirs, the community at large? Who's got skin in the game that we call success? So when I think about this work, in this frame, I find it useful. It helps me understand if we're going to change the system, what does the system look like? And this is how I think of the system. So I guess I'll just leave it at that and imagine and hope that it might inform your thinking. And we'll, well, actually, no, there's one more thing I was going to say. It slipped my mind, so but I'm coming back. So you hear that healthcare is complicated, and you hear that it's complex. So which is it? If it's complicated, a watch is complicated. Right? A watch is complicated, which is to say the parts are essentially replaceable. If you break a gear, you pop a spring, all you do is replace it. And the system, the structure, the watch keeps on ticking. But we're not like that. In fact, we're complex. And we're complex because we're not gears, we're not widgets, we're not springs. Rather, we have experience, culture, relationships, and that's what makes us complex. And if you replace one of us in one of our roles, the system might not function as well. And similarly, the way it functions isn't only because of things like role clarity and work as imagined, but also because of the stuff below the waterline, the relationships, the experiences we have. And the way I'd like to think about this is, you know, when you make a phone call to somebody at work that you know versus a phone call, someone at work that you don't know. It's just such a different experience. Whether it's giving a report, asking for a favor, asking for some mentorship, some guidance, some, you know, navigation through the system, what have you. And so it's important for me to think about the relationship between above and below the waterline. So those are some high-level thoughts on some of the LEADS framework around self, around values, around system. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to share some of those thoughts. Happy to carry on the conversation in whatever manner it comes. And thank you so much for what you do. We sure appreciate you being in healthcare. Cheers. Bye now.